jump right in. All righty, let us jump in. We're on our way towards more specific reflection on the programmatic. And one of the real challenges of talking about the programmatic is often ensuring that we don't reduce it to the technocratic. Usually when people talk about the programmatic, they think of various forms of managerial and technocratic policies. I think we've made it very, very clear in this class that we're talking about vision in motion, vision enacted, vision embodied. But the details are always subordinate to the various direction that you're taking, to use the language of Professor Unger. Given the fact that so much of the nation has been attending to the 50th anniversary of Brother Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination or execution or murder or killing, what's often overlooked is what was going on April the 5th, 1968. There's over 125 cities and towns in flames. First time since the Civil War, bless you, that the National Guard is called out to protect the White House. It was an attempt to burn the White House down. The level of rage that was overflowing would have been something that Brother Martin would not have agreed with at all, but that level of rage was out of control. I recall I was 14 years old in Sacramento, California, and just major blocks were burned down. The city of Wilmington, Delaware, which is not known like Detroit or Newark for its black rebellions. You had U.S. tanks in the city for 6 months, from April until October. The fundamental foundations of American democracy, the fundamental pillars of the American empire were shaking. And we don't hear a lot of talk about that. But there'd never been that level of rebellion since the Civil War. Watch 65, yes, Los Angeles with Rodney King. Now you get various waves of protests and demonstrations with police shooting, sometimes killing young people disproportionately, black and brown, female and male. But April 5th, 1968, there has never been a day in the history of this nation like it. So to teach a course on American democracy and to accent the Civil War and how crucial that particular series of events were, and not to also acknowledge April 5th, 1968 would be really negligent on our part. And we have to keep in mind that Martin Luther King Jr., he was in no way pure or pristine. He was a failed and flawed human being with all kinds of foibles like any other human being. But he still was extraordinary in so many ways. And so much of it had to do with the fact that for him, he was convinced that what was sucking the real free and democratic elements out of the U.S. experiment, poverty, war, materialism, and racism. He talked about those four over and over again. And when he was murdered, he was isolated, he was lonely, he was alienated, he had been marginalized. 72% of Americans thoroughly disapproved of him. 51% of black Americans disapproved of his attempt to bring poor people together and his critique of Vietnam. He was a hated man. He was held in contempt. Time magazine, the New York Times, the Washington Post said over and over again, His critique of Vietnam reads like a radio script from Hanoi. He needs to stay confined to civil rights, and it's clear he's being radicalized by communists. The leading black journalist of the day, the first black journalist to have his TV show. And this is very interesting when you think of echoes of MSNBC under Barack Obama, with all the black folk with their television shows and so forth. Carl Rowan writes in the Reader's Digest. I don't know if you all remember the Reader's Digest. That was a highly influential journal. Is that still around? Reader's Digest, do you know? Does anybody still read the Reader's Digest? It was a widely circulated small package. We used to receive it right there in the ghetto in Sacramento, in Glen Elder. And Carl Rowan would write one of the most influential pieces where he says, Martin Luther King Jr. suffers from a disease of exaggerated self-importance. It's clear he's under communist influence, and most importantly, he has armed the Negro's foes and alienated the Negro's friends. So this is what's coming at Brother Martin Luther King Jr. He speaks in Chicago in 1967 at the politics convention of the New Left. He's booed, he's heckled. 90-some% of Christian churches close their pulpits to Martin Luther King Jr. So he no longer has access to enacting his fundamental vocation, which is that of a Christian minister. I remember I was blessed to speak in upstate New York a couple of years ago. We had an old black brother walked up to me, 93 years old, on a stick. And the room held about 600, and we had a nice crowd. And he said, oh, Brother West, he said, I remember when Martin King came here, and he only had about 100 people because all of the Christian ministers, black and white, had mobilized and told their congregations, make sure you do not hear this heretic speak. See, that's the Martin King we're talking about. Now, he's broadly, if not universally, loved today. But in April 3rd, 1968, he is loathed by most in America. Why? In part because he was trying to not just talk about, but to bring about very much what this class is about. We can talk all we want about alternative visions, analysis, strategies, programmatic orientations, and so forth. But here you get somebody whose movement, in all of its fallibility, tries to create an alternative, you see, and the response. Powers on high, J. Edgar Hoover. He's the most dangerous man in America. He's under surveillance from 1956 until the day of his death. His photographer, who took over 10,000 pictures of Martin Luther King Jr., who's part of the family, his name is Ernest Withers, was an FBI agent, calling the FBI every day. Lyndon Baines Johnson, who had worked very closely and courageously and sincerely with the Black Freedom Movement to push through 64 Civil Rights Bill and 65 Voting Rights Bill and so forth. But he's calling Martin Luther King Jr. an N-I-G-G-E-R preacher who needs to quit talking about Vietnam and doesn't know what the so-and-so he's talking about. We know Lyndon Baines Johnson liked to use a lot of colorful language. That's the way he was. But he was hard on Martin. So Martin's all by himself. His one true friend really at this time is Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. He's one of the great prophetic figures of the 20th century. And he stood by Martin. He had his critique of the U.S. empire. Of course, he's marginalized by his own respective Jewish community. But he would say over and over again, as he went with Martin different places, the future of America depends on the influence and impact of Martin Luther King Jr. and his legacy. And if America fails in regard to war or militarism, poverty or wealth inequality or racism or any form of xenophobia, and materialism, which is a matter of the soul craft that we've been talking about throughout this class. If America fails on those four fronts, its democratic experiment is a failure. No matter how much money, prosperity, no matter how many goods and services it produces, if it's not available and if it doesn't create democratic ways of life, it is a failure, a relative failure. Doesn't mean it's fascist, doesn't mean it's outright authoritarian, doesn't mean it's equivalent to the repression and regimentation of the Soviet Union. It's a relative failure based on democratic criteria. That's Rabbi Joshua Heschel, that's Martin Luther King Jr. Now, what do we learn from what Martin King was talking about? Martin King did have certain programmatic elements in his Weltanschauung, in his vision, you see. He talked about the world house, that we live in a world house, and that we must think internationally and globally. So he would always begin with the military budget, military-industrial complex in the last 3 years of his life. So already it pits him against the liberal establishment, the very liberal establishment of which he was a darling in 62 and 3, God bless you, 64 and 5. Now he's an enemy because he's bringing critique to bear of empire. He's beginning to talk much more about Latin America. He's already talked about Africa. He was there in 1957 at the Ghana's Independence Day with Nkrumah. So he's now over against a liberal establishment, speaking programmatically about the military budget. Eugene McCarthy asked Martin to support him. He has a critique of the military budget. He's thinking about running for president. You see, people are asking Martin himself to run. He said, no, I've been running for a long time, from the police to Klan and a lot of other folk. He says, but no, I'm not a politician. Martin would say over and over again during this period, these last 3 years, he would say it's very clear that most folk never knew me. They never know what my calling is. Never knew what my commitment was. I was never first and foremost a civil rights activist. I was never first and foremost a black leader. You see, I was never first and foremost an American citizen. That American flag is under the cross. It's under unarmed truth and unconditional love. You see, I'm proud to be an American citizen. Martin King was a patriot, in stark contrast to Malcolm X. He was a patriot, but it was always penultimate. And what was ultimate was unarmed truth, the condition of truth, allowing suffering to speak. Unapologetic, unconditional love. That's not colorblindness. We just had a wonderful class with Brother Jonathan Walton. It's not colorblindness at all. It's life, it's love, embracing of others in all of their bodiliness and all of their cultural background and all of their various orientations, political, ideological, sexual, and so forth and so on. Calling for that beloved community, knowing the beloved community would never, ever fully be realized or actualized in space and time, in history, but living as if he was already a part of a beloved community. That's Martin Luther King Jr. And he comes from a long tradition. Mordecai Johnson, Howard Thurman, Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, who had already been enacting what he was talking about. So when he begins then with the military budget, he says, oh, I see it's expanding, that what Dwight Eisenhower said was right in his last speech before he handed over the mantle to JFK. He says this military budget is out of control, and each time we buy a bomb, we're taking money away from education. We're taking money away with jobs with a living wage. We're taking money away for decent housing. We're taking money away from the kind of social, not just programs, but social provisions available to the weak and the vulnerable. The interplay between guns and butter, to use the crude metaphors, as it were, is something that Martin Luther King Jr. echoing. I mean, Dwight Eisenhower is himself a military man, highly acclaimed general, president of Columbia University, president of the United States twice. Seeing more and more consolidated power, unaccountable in terms of people even having a public conversation about it. And sometimes unlimited budgets outside of congressional approval, or easy deference of congressional elites vis-a-vis military elites. You see. Permanent war economy. We talked about the war mobilization as the real response, as it were, to the Depression. And Sister Tammy, Roberto's beloved wife, has written about this with profound wisdom and analytical power. And this war mobilization continued. And to this day, among the liberals and neoliberals, very little scrutiny, let alone critique of it. When Martin Luther King Jr. engaged in his critique of Vietnam, more and more he began to say, you can't talk about the programmatic domestically without understanding America as empire and imperial policies. And we raised the question, well, what was it that led Martin Luther King Jr. to be so concerned about the war such that he was willing to sacrifice his popularity for what he perceived to be his integrity? Well, one was Coretta herself was an activist. And she had been marching against the war before Martin came out publicly. The second was that Martin Luther King Jr. had a favorite son in Mississippi who, when he first met Martin King, told him that he fundamentally disagreed with his nonviolent philosophy and carried a gun. He was about 18 years old. Martin said, no, you can't carry a gun in my march, but he continued to have dialogue with this young person. He was introduced to Martin by Stokely Carmichael. And 2.5 years later, Martin went back to Mississippi looking for his favorite son. Knocked on the door. The mother answered with tears in her eyes and said, he went to Vietnam and was killed. And Stokely told Martin, you taught him about nonviolence in Mississippi, but you didn't say a mumbling word about nonviolence in Vietnam. So he ended up actually marching with Martin without his gun. Martin had convinced him. But he ended up going to Vietnam, a draft. It wasn't a volunteer army like today, a draft. A conscription. And he ends up dying. Martin was devastated. Devastated. Maybe it's clear that I'm not being morally consistent with my pacifism. Morally consistent with my nonviolent philosophy. Hit him very hard. And then there's a famous story of him in Jamaica working on his book and looking at Ramparts magazine and seeing the precious Vietnamese children who were killed by napalm. All of their bodies tarred and so forth. He was just overwhelmed by it. All of these factors coming together, leading toward Martin King saying, I'm going to make militarism, I'm going to make anti-war policy and ideology, and I'm going to engage in critiques of the U.S. empire. And it's clear once he crossed that line that he was more and more in a world of even more trouble than he was before. But he then made the connection between war and poverty. He said the bombs dropped in Vietnam land on reservations, ghettos, poor whites in Appalachia, poor browns in Los Angeles. Intimate connection between war and poverty, guns and butter. And in fact, the very war that Lyndon Baines Johnson had the courage to declare on poverty would be gutted financially by the funds needed for the war in Vietnam. And of course, the war in Vietnam was focused, but he also had critiques. It's important to keep in mind of what the United States was doing at the time in Latin America. 64 in Brazil, right? Goulart. 65, Dominican Republic. We can go on and on and on. U.S. policy, sometimes overthrowing democratic regimes, sometimes reinforcing militaristic ones, ... Martin more and more giving speeches, connecting with the various groups. Clergy and Laity Concern, one of the organizations founded, co-founded by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, Richard Newhouse, William Sloane Coffin, begging Martin to become a member. He finally decided to become a member. Primarily an anti-war organization, part of an anti-war movement. And it's quite striking when you think about our own day. The United States at war right now. Been at war 10 years. It's hard to think of an anti-war movement, anti-war demonstration. What's going on? 26,171 bombs dropped in 2016 under Barack Obama. We've had some demonstrations in front of the White House, but it's very small. People think we're just a little choir singing songs or something. There's drone strikes, 563 of them in the last administration. Some talk, Cole Pink and Medea Benjamin and a few others, very little talk about anti-war activity, you see. Rendered invisible, you see. Martin Luther King Jr. more and more thinking that if we're going to talk programmatically and not make the connection between the domestic and foreign policy, that we're actually simply truncating our own ability to engage in transformative vision and transformative analysis, strategy, and programs. War, poverty, and then materialism. That seems so abstract. Materialism, why is that to be included in any talk about the programmatic? And I think at this point, in this class, going back to the Tocqueville, that the issues of structures of values and structures of feeling play such a crucial role that in a culture of superficial spectacle and conspicuous consumption and the reduction of citizens to consumers who think they're just making choices as opposed to cultivating virtues and cultivating values of courage and service to public good and getting outside of one's own ego and being tied to something bigger and broader than oneself, then all the talk in the world about transformative vision still lands on relatively barren soil. Because the attempt to engage in an awakening around public life sits at the very center of transformation in democratic projects. And Martin Luther King Jr. understood this. So that when he talked about materialism, he was also talking about that rugged, ragged, rapacious individualism and narcissism and hedonism and egoism that makes it difficult for people to care about their neighbors on the other side of town, their poor neighbors, their female neighbors, their brown neighbors and red neighbors and yellow neighbors and black neighbors and so forth, you see. So that for him, the war, poverty, materialism, and last but not least, the racism. Now, unfortunately, I don't know how many of you all kept track with some of the activities yesterday. Did you see some of the activities? I don't have a television, so did they have representation of what was going on in Memphis yesterday? Did anybody see that yesterday? Nobody did at all. No, I wasn't on TV yesterday. Huh? Oh, with Anderson. You're right. God, that's right. Yeah, you're right. I forgot about that, my dear sister. I wasn't part of the circus in Memphis, though. No, I was here in Watertown with my working class brothers and sisters. But it was the dialogue that we had. No, you're right. I'd forgotten about that. No, but I was talking about the circus in Memphis, where you get all the spectacle of the various voices and figures, and the bell rang 39 times, I was told. And I asked the question, did anybody say anything about empire or war? Did anybody say anything about the military-industrial complex now? Not Martin talking about it then. Did anybody connect racism to wealth inequality? It's so easy to isolate the police activity, police abuse. Our dear brother Stephon Clark in my beloved hometown of Sacramento as another number, or what happened in Brooklyn yesterday, and Utica and Washington, with another black person killed, on and on and on. That often is the isolated discourse connected to a Martin King, when it's very clear King had an overarching vision that was global, international, domestic, regional, hemispheric, and so on. So you get that reduction, the sanitizing, sterilizing, domesticating, taming. I would call it the Santa Clausification of Martin Luther King Jr. Turn him into Santa Claus. Old man with a smile, toys in his bag. Everybody loving him. Can't wait to give out the toys because they think, oh, there's no risk that involved. That's what we love about Santa Claus. And maybe there is a risk to come from the North Pole to make it through Harlem. But for Martin King, it was a life of risk. It was a life of service and sacrifice. It wasn't Santa Claus at all. It wasn't toys at all. It was trying to convince people, let's organize. Let's learn how to think critically. Let's learn how to love embracingly across the board. And most importantly, let's have a historical memory that will inform our vision as it shapes our programmatic thinking. Now, Martin called for a guaranteed income because for him, he called himself an abolitionist. He's in the tradition of Frederick Douglass, who wanted to abolish slavery. He's in the tradition of Ida B. Wells, who wanted to abolish lynching. He said, I'm an abolitionist. I want to abolish poverty. Reminds me of our dear brother here at Harvard, my dear brother, Tommy Shelby, who's an abolitionist in terms of ghettos, his recent book on dark ghettos. It's called for an abolition of ghettos across the country, no matter what color. Abolish them, you see. Well, Martin says, I'm part of an abolitionist movement. Now, was he also trying to abolish war? Well, Benjamin Spock used that language. Martin's Christian sensibility led him to recognize he would never abolish it, but it's a matter of trying to understand what the ugly effects of it actually were and ways in which he could generate pacifists who would not participate in it, you see. But annual income tied to abolition of poverty, but most importantly, an accountability of corporate elites. Martin Luther King Jr., in the last 3 years of his life, said over and over again, some form of highly creative democratic socialism will be required in order to come to terms with corporate greed at the top. Keep in mind that when he received the call for the Nobel Prize, young age of 34, first thing he said was, you should give it not to me, you should give it to Norman Thomas. I'm sure many of you know who Norman Thomas actually is or was. But Norman Thomas was the head of the U.S. Socialist Party. He was a student of Woodrow Wilson at Princeton. He graduated summa cum laude at Princeton. He went on to get a degree at Union Theological Seminary. He took a Presbyterian church in Harlem, East Harlem. He lost his religious faith, but kept his deep commitment to justice and compassion, and remained a socialist for the next 45 years. He ran 4 times against FDR. In fact, there's a wonderful story about Norman Thomas in FDR's office, where he says, you know, Norman, he says, I appreciate your moral energy, but it's clear that I'm a better politician than you are. So Norman would get about 2% every 4 years. FDR wins handily, you see. But Martin Luther King Jr. viewed Norman Thomas as one of his fundamental sources of his calling. In fact, in my text, The Radical King, I have an essay. There's an essay that Martin Luther King wrote that had been never published. I pulled that thing out of a magazine called The Bravest Man I Ever Met, Martin Luther King Jr. Who was it? Norman Thomas. Norman Thomas. Again, overlooked. You never really knew me. You never really understood my calling. Martin Luther King Jr. is not to be confined to just black figures, even though Benjamin Mays and Walter Chivers and Mordecai Johnson are very important. But when it comes to the bravest man I ever met, you would think it'd be his father. No. His father put the fear of God in Martin, but he wouldn't say he's the bravest man. Norman Thomas. Why? Because Norman Thomas was calling for democratic accountability of Wall Street, democratic accountability of American Motors Company, democratic accountability of corporate and financial elites. What form would that take? Very important question. Hardly spelled out. And this takes us back to Professor Unger's concerns about how do you think outside of neoliberal frameworks? How do you think in regard to issues of the economy when it's so vague, when it's so oblique, democratic accountability of Wall Street? What would that look like? You see, it's
Cornell,
yes.
Could I ask you a question?
Sure.
About the form of action in Martin Luther King's life, and do so by comparing him to another figure, Gandhi.
Gandhi, okay.
And I ask it as a bridge to a theme that I wanted to introduce in the second half of today's class. The theme is the relation between transformation of institutions and transformation of consciousness, and especially consciousness as it is manifest in the direct relations among people, in the formulas of interpersonal relations. So we could relabel this question, the question about the relation between the macro politics of institutions and the micro politics of personal relations, which is also consciousness. So we've discussed here this, that the country now needs to realize its promise, a different institutional direction, but the different institutional direction to advance requires as well a transformation of consciousness.
Absolutely.
The fundamental idea of the greatness of the ordinary man and woman has to be liberated from the double taint of institutional idolatry and of an individualistic conception of self-construction that views solidarity as something external to self-construction. Now, there's this problem, which is the problem that I wanted to present to the class in the second half of our meeting today, which is that no one knows how these two levels of transformation can be coordinated. Because when we're speaking about the politics of institutions regarding the use of governmental power, the conquest and use of the power of the state, there is an agent. The agent are the political parties. related or not to social movements. But who or what is the agent that relates the transformation of institutions or structure to the transformation of consciousness? It seems that such an agent could not exist, even in principle, and yet it must exist. Tocqueville remarked that every profound transformation is both a transformation, a political revolution, and a religious revolution, by which he meant both a change of structure and a change of consciousness. Then comes, and this brings me now to the question of King and Gandhi. We have in the 20th century the example of these figures who embody a certain kind of response to this very problem. And there are certain common elements that we can see in these figures. So one is the focus of concern. The focus of concern is the diminishment of the human being, that the human being is belittled, humiliated. It's not just injustice, although injustice is part of it. It's the forfeit of our higher vocation to increase our share in the attributes that we ascribe to the divine. And so characteristically, their action is backed up by a spiritual vision, related or not to an organized religion. Then they focus on certain wounds in social life, in which this evil of belittlement is manifest directly in certain aspects of society. And not just in the abstract, not just in institutions, but in the direct relations of people. Absolutely. And so there's a form of action, as in Gandhi's practice of ritual defilement, touching the untouchables, doing what is prohibited, which is the enactment in the detail of personal relations of a different way of relating to other people. Not just the institutional structure, not just the macro level, but the micro level.
Absolutely.
Now, furthermore, then, these figures combine in their activity a visionary teaching with exemplary action. And it's exemplary action with respect to these wounds, which are the evils of belittlement, of humiliation, of our failure to make ourselves more godlike, to become more human by becoming more godlike, which is what they propose to us. Now, there's a further characteristic of the activity of these figures, which is disturbing to us. And the further characteristic is that characteristically, they renounce worldly power. They stand apart from politics in the lesser sense. So even though Gandhi was a leading figure of the independence movement and associated with the affirmation of the national idea, he himself renounced the pursuit of governmental power. So
individually.
So there was a party he was associated with,
Absolutely.
but his relation to the party was very complicated, the Congress Party. They used him more than he used them. They manipulated him.
Absolutely.
And he was unable to resolve the problem of the relation of this transformative activity to temporal power, as it really exists in politics. So here's the problem then, and this is the relation to the issue that I wanted to address. These figures, like King and Gandhi, seem to provide some kind of answer to this question of how we can coordinate the macro politics of institutions or structures with the micro politics of consciousness and personal relations. However, they do so only at the margins of worldly power. That is, to to show how this coordination can take place, they have to renounce power. And it's as if they did this coordination, but only at the sidelines, in a way, in some form of testimonial activity. So what are we to make of this? That's my question.
But it's in the context of movements. Though,
yeah, so it's in the context of movements.
And those movements are contesting power, bringing
it's
tremendous
true.
pressure to bear on
It's true. So as in the example of Gandhi. So Gandhi was intimately related to the independence movement.
Absolutely.
The independence movement had a political wing. It sought power, and it eventually won power.
Nehru and
yes,
absolutely.
But
that the same way.
But that relation was complicated.
Oh,
so they.
Gandhi used to say we have to be the change that we're calling for. That was his attempt to accent the moral and existential challenges of persons in movements with the social visions of those movements that had to come to terms with systems of power. Martin Luther King was the same way. Martin Luther King would call over and over again for a kind of personal and moral transformation in which you stay in contact with the humanity of the other person. That's why he could call Bull O'Connor his brother. Now, Bull O'Connor was the gangster in Birmingham, sheriff, condoning vicious attacks on black people. When King stands up in the pulpit and says, Bull O'Connor is my brother. Why? Because he's made in the image of God, he's a Christian. Why? Because he can change like anybody else. Why? Because his humanity is not fully exhausted in his gangster-like actions. That there's some more beyond just his gangster-like actions. Is he involved in white supremacist activity that allows for the killing and forgiveness? Absolutely. So that the spiritual is not reducible to the political for either one of those figures, but they're involved in, if not leaders of movements, that have to deal with the intricacies of power.
So there are two readings, right, of this experience. There's the optimistic reading and the pessimistic reading. The optimistic reading is that they perform this alchemy, this miracle of relating the two forms of transformation outside of politics, but they are related to movements that go into politics. Right. And so the connection is established through some kind of division of labor within humanity. That's the optimistic reading. The pessimistic reading is that the coordination that seems to be indispensable between these two types of politics cannot take place in the real world, except at the cost of the renunciation of temporal power by those who most directly embody it. This is a very interesting problem because if we have an ambitious view of politics, we have to think of politics in this broader frame as involving the transformation of consciousness and of interpersonal relations. And it has to be related to the transformation of politics, of structures, of institutions, which is the affair of the political parties, of the politicians, and so forth. But who makes them converge? And so this is really the question that is at the heart of the puzzle that I had intended to raise later in the class, but that is immediately aroused by your words about King.
Yeah. Because the thing is, when we talk about the militarism of war, the poverty of wealth inequality, or the materialism and ending with racism, see, for Martin King, the arts are going to be central as forms of power. They are temporal powers. They are, in some sense, political powers, but they're not powers that reside fundamentally within institutions and structures in which resources are being distributed. So that, for example, as a minister, anybody who hears Martin Luther King Jr. speak knows that brother is an artist. Oratory is a species of art. I would say oratory is a species of music in its own way. That's a power. That's a very important power, you see. Learning how to love is a power. If you've been taught to hate yourself and you love yourself, that's empowerment. If you've been taught to hate others, you're taught to hate white people, and you learn, lo and behold, they're human and therefore they are worthy to be criticized, affirmed, as well as critiqued and rendered accountable, that is a power. That's what transformation is. That's what the arts do in that way. And so when Du Bois, for example, talked about, I'm concerned about focusing on the powers behind the veil. The powers behind the veil. On the other side of the wall that white supremacy created in America with segregation and walls of separation, there's powers over there. It's in the music. It's in the arts. They don't have a lot of economic power. They hardly have any political power at all. They got a whole lot of other kind of powers at their best. That's part of power struggle. And you don't want a conception of power that is so reductionist or narrow or truncated that is only state power. If you don't have state power, you are nothing. No, that's not it at all.
On the other hand, you can't circumvent state power.
Yes, but you have to come to terms with state power
because those who win the power of the state make the laws.
Absolutely.
And therefore the structure.
Absolutely.
So this is one of the illusions of some forms of contemporary leftism. You can just forget about the state and about the law.
That's right.
But you can't forget about it.
No, absolutely. Martin King would never forget about it. That's why you see him shaking hands with Lyndon Baines Johnson when Lyndon Baines Johnson signs the bill of '64 for civil rights. Shakes his hand again at '65, signing the Bill of Voting Rights. He's dealing with the head of the empire. He's dealing with the president of the nation state. And he's put enough pressure on Johnson and company and Congress to have impact on state power. But he also knows if state power is the fundamental source of his self-conception, then he's just a victim. And when you view yourself as solely a victim, you've already stripped yourself, deprived yourself of other kinds of powers you can have access to, as opposed to just being an actor within state power. We should open it up for questions.
Peter.
Yes, Brother Peter. That's right.
To changing the value system of those who are participating. Even 50 years later, many of them say that the internal cultivation was even as important to them as the Civil Rights Act.
Absolutely.
And yet, most left-wing movements today, progressive movements today, have almost no internal cultivation. They never ask you to be a better person. They never ask you to conform, your freedom and choice. They say, oh, everyone's welcome, we're all working on the cause, but they never say, we need to be this type of neighbor, we need to be this type of, we need to live up to these roles, we need to deny ourselves some things. So, one, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this lack of self-cultivation in the communities of the left. Second is in response to the question of why do these movements have to sacrifice power? Is it not possible to have a party or an electoral movement also have a spiritual element to it? The best example, I'd say, in recent decades is the Solidarity movement in Poland, which was a political movement that also was deeply transformative and revolutionary, according to them.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear your two thoughts.
No,
Well, but I didn't follow the intention of the solidarity example. How are you using the solidarity example?
In response to your thing that these transformative movements with prophetic voice and spiritual elements are usually disconnected from party politics, you remarked, or at least in the case.
But solidarity was a political movement.
So I'm saying solidarity is an example of a political movement that was tied to a party, and cannot
No, of course, but is it an example of the other thing, of the transformation of consciousness and of personal relations?
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, because, you know, another way of presenting the issue is historically in the United States. So take the first half of the 19th century. There was Jacksonian populism. There were concrete political economic struggles. For example, the struggle over the National Bank of the United States, culminating in Jackson's presidency in the dissolution of the National Bank, which was the major instrument of the financial plutocracy in the country of that time. So that's an example of a structural movement. And the political economic populism in an attempt to democratize the economic order, selectively, to be sure, in agriculture and in finance, and with the great exception of African slavery. But at the same time in the United States, there were these religious movements, which we call the Great Awakening, in which Christianity underwent a transformation that involved its reckoning with democracy in some deep way. Now, and these two tendencies, the political economic tendency in the populism of the Jackson period and the Great Awakening, were somehow related. But how were they related? And who made them related? So that's once against the issue of agency. So if there's to be a profound transformation, the transformation can't just be, as Cornell said, about political and economic power at the top. It has to be about consciousness and interpersonal relations. And there have to be equivalents to the Great Awakening of the early 19th century. But how does that happen? How do we make it happen? Since there's no agent that even in principle could be responsible for such a contagion. That's the puzzle that I'm trying to raise.
How do you think solidarity is?
I don't think solidarity is an example of that, on my understanding. I think it was a political movement with a Christian background, but I don't think it had this wider spiritual task of the transformation of consciousness and of interpersonal relations.
What you think?
In fact, its attitude to personal relations seems to have been very orthodox and conservative. It was a narrow form of Catholicism, rather than any program for the radical transformation of interpersonal relations in Polish society, which the Great Awakening in early 19th century America did involve. That's the difference. But the Great Awakening was not part of, at least directly, of the pursuit of political power.
But in the case of the Civil Rights Movement or the Black Freedom Movement led by Martin King and Ella Baker and Diane Nash and Bob Moses and others, I mean, the very notion of being fundamentally committed to nonviolence as a way of life in an empire that made its way through the world by using violence, that requires profound self-cultivation. That requires deep personal transformation and revolution in how you look at the world. Every TV show they're exposed to, every U.S. history book about the frontier, every attack on indigenous peoples, every understanding of how the working class was violently subjugated. I mean, the violence is so integral to America's history. Here you're committed to a way of life, not just a tactic and a strategy. Even though Stokely Carmichael and many others understood nonviolence as a strategy. Martin King said, no, this is a way of life. That kind of internal cultivation, you can call it almost rituals of purification. This is how you learn how to be nonviolent. This is how you learn to continually love the person and hate the deed, or love the sinner and hate the sin, because it was a deeply Christian influence movement too. There's no doubt about that. So that the charitable Christian hatred, that was part of the ideology of Martin King. He fundamentally committed to charitable Christian hatred. You hate the sin and love the sinner. And he was willing to bank his life on that. And that was one of the reasons why he was marginalized at the end of his life more and more by the young revolutionaries, you see, all the folk who contributed to his isolation. And so in that sense, these days, it's so difficult to conceive of a social movement. One is because electoral campaigns, given all the frenzy that they generate, have nothing to do with self-cultivation. It's all to do with a candidate, even when they're decent candidates like my dear brother Bernie. But it's not self-cultivation at all. That's not social movement. That's not internal transformation. That's taking citizens as they are and push. Or demonstration, just show up, be there. That's not self-cultivation either. The feminist movement was about internal transformation. Oh, yes. You had to undergo processes of freeing yourself from unbelievable patriarchal internalization, and that process of de-patriarchalization is a very painful one in the heart, mind, and soul of any woman, because patriarchy cuts so deep in all of our souls, no matter what gender we are. So it's very difficult to conceive of social movements these days that has these kinds of commitments to internal self-cultivation, like the civil rights movement. There was another hand that jumped up. Jump in on that.
Just a comment about that. Mm-hmm. The term self-cultivation is worrisome in one respect, because the issue is the relation between the transformation of institutions and the transformation of consciousness. Transformation of consciousness is hard to describe as self-cultivation. So the ordinary interpretation of the term self-cultivation is its connection with the traditional forms of voluntary association in the United States. So the Boy Scouts, the Rotary Club, they do self-cultivation, and they are associated with political movements. But their whole purpose is the reproduction of an established form of consciousness in the society, not its radical transformation by touching on these wounds, as I call them, in the society. That's something else, and because that's incendiary. So that's the transformation of the way in which people relate to one another, not to embody in the way of acting their pre-existing moral beliefs, but to change their beliefs, some revolution in their sensibility. So that's something else, and that doesn't fit in the Rotary Club or the Boy Scouts or in your example of solidarity. But that has happened in history, as in this early 19th century American example, and that's what would need to happen again. So my question is really, how does it happen? And how is it that we get these two parts, these two indispensable parts of transformation to work together, given that there can't be an agent on top of them coordinating them?
Well, there are agents on top in terms of leaders. I want to defend Peter a little bit. When you talk about self-cultivation, you talk about the culture of a movement, the culture of an institution.
Let's take civil rights as an example. One was a revolution in consciousness. Nonviolence is a different ideology.
Yes.
Than the other one.
Right.
There's also this semi-neutral, I'm scared to use the term neutral, but a commitment to just do anything. You know, to do anything besides your own desires is required of any change in consciousness. And like the thing that any movement is fighting against is just, you want to do what you want every day, but I'm going to ask you to do something, differently than your base desires. And so
that lifts you above your private concerns and above family selfishness.
Boy Scouts do, but then
Yes. Yes.
The skills you learn in Boy Scouts of lifting yourself among your private concerns can help you have a revolutionary consciousness.
Yes.
Our dear sister wants to jump in here.
Yes, I'm wondering if a possible solution would be just to create schools that teach us from younger and for longer to contemplate how we actually think. Unless you start to specialize, I don't remember having an educational program where we taught our brain how we think to practice mindfulness. And so I'm wondering if maybe perhaps not this current generation or even the next,
Mm.
Because we don't practice the art of thinking about how we think.
And you're drawing a distinction. You tell me if I'm right or wrong, between how to think and what to think.
Right, because, well, we can't control that because then that would be that well, I don't know if we necessarily want to do that, but I'm wondering if just the general act of practicing mindfulness, just thinking about how you think, if that would even assist us as just a group being into thinking higher.
Yeah. Because it's important to keep in mind, the civil rights movement did have freedom schools. These were countervailing, counter-hegemonic educational institutions of what it means to think both critically as you live nonviolently. So if you're going to engage in a critique of a dominant ideology of an empire in which violence has been part and parcel of its way of life, and you're telling some of the most vulnerable citizens in that empire, you must learn how to live nonviolently, think critically. You need a different educational system. And they had freedom schools all throughout the South. But it was more than just how to think, though. There was content there. The love ethic was there. The pacifism was there. The history of the love warriors, of those who'd come before, who tried to, the Elijah Lovejoys, and abolitionist movements who also were trying to connect love and justice and critiques of America in the 19th century. All that history was brought to bear in these freedom schools.
But is that also teaching, and I don't have a problem with this, but is it also teaching about the spirit?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
How is that justified, especially, with the whole rule of religion? Not that those are the same, but the fact that it's such a big, to me, it seems like it's a big movement to remove religion and the talk of spirituality from our institutions, but yet still, scientifically, I believe we're pretty close to identify that these are real things. Is it possible then to teach about the spirit in a loving way that does not necessarily lead to a specific religion, also reminds us of how to think that these two, the teaching of your thoughts, your brain and spirit will naturally, organically bring about some sort of religion.
So long as it's not some kind of indoctrination, right?
Not imposing
But let's generalize the question, because this approach you suggest is very useful. So, what are the possible bases of changes of consciousness? So let's take the focus, which has been central to our arguments in the course, which is the focus of the empowerment of the ordinary man and woman, right? This energizing of the people. So they think of themselves as big and capable collectively as well as individually of big projects. It's the idea of shared bigness. So one source are the actual institutions. So it's no use having a doctrine about this if the reality of daily life is the denial of that doctrine. So then there's these concrete issues, as in the organization of the economy. The form of production that's closest to the imagination, which is now the knowledge economy, has to be widely disseminated. The worker can't be abandoned to precarious employment, because precarious employment then constrains him and oppresses this expression of entrepreneurial energy. And then in the future, the worker can't work as if he were a machine. He should do only what machines can't do. Economically dependent wage labor shouldn't be the predominant form of free labor in the future. It should give way to self-employment and cooperation and so forth. And we would say the same thing about politics, about the organization of politics. The energizing of the people requires a transformation of the political institutions to elevate the level of popular engagement in political life, to hasten the pace of politics through the rapid resolution of impasse, to combine strong central initiative with local deviation, countermodels of the national future. So it's the institutional reality which then sustains the change of consciousness. That's one basis. Now comes the second basis. The second basis is education, as you suggested, but not by indoctrination. For example, the school doesn't enhance the ability to cooperate by teaching the students the value of cooperation as a theory. It does this by exemplifying cooperation in the way in which education is organized, by having a dialectical approach to receive knowledge, teaching everything from contrasting points of view. The mind is liberated. The mind as imagination comes to prevail over the life as machine. Now comes then a third source of change of consciousness. Spiritual movements, as in the Great Awakening. And because the most important religion in the United States has been Christianity, historically, then there's a struggle within Christianity and within each religion. And there would be, to take the example of Christianity, two great themes that would have to be confronted. One is the theme of the privatization of religion in the middle period of the history of Protestantism, which had immense influence in the United States. Religion is just a matter of private conscience. It's not the basis of a public voice. But for Martin Luther King, it was the basis for a public voice. And we can't allow this privatization of religion, because then we lose one of the main sources of transformative energy. Then the second theme in Christianity that has to be confronted, the tradition, the strand within Christianity that emphasizes our radical and passive dependence upon God, as opposed to the idea of our response to divine grace and our increase of our share in the attributes of divinity, our participation in the divine life. Those are theological struggles, and they would have to go on in each religion. I just gave the particular form it would take in Christianity. Now comes the fourth cause, the fourth basis of change in consciousness. Ideas, even the ideas in the high academic culture. So the ideas now in the crucial disciplines, such as economics and law, are naturalizations or rationalizations of the established form of social life. They cut the vital link between insight into the actual and imagination of the adjacent possible. That's not just a philosophical dispute. It involves a contest in each of these disciplines over their agenda. A contest within economics, a contest within law, within legal thought, a contest in the high academic culture within each of the specialized disciplines. So I've given you an example of four terrains that bear on this transformation of consciousness. Well, that's wonderful. It's a vast struggle. But where's the master plan of this struggle, and who does this? And who makes it so that I send the armies in this direction in the high academic culture, and in education I dispatch you, the other regiment? This doesn't exist. Yes?
Is there room, though, for, you know how everyone talks about the Aquarian age, where humanity, spirit just kind of rises to this place collectively. So the low is higher, the higher is lower. Is it possible that humanity will just evolve, and our concepts in general will also mature? So it doesn't necessarily need like one person or one organization or one ideology to constantly lead on. Just the fact of evolving the educational process combined with this natural occurrence that may happen on the spirit level, would you need specifically a designated agent to help bring this on?
So this is related to this problem of the difference between historical and biographical time, right? Because we as individuals are not going to be engaged simultaneously or even over the whole of our life in all of these terrains. So according to our talents and our circumstances, we do one thing or we do another. We we mutilate ourselves. We become something in particular. And so this task that I'm describing is not a task that even in principle could ever be performed within the existence of an individual. The individual is doing only part of this. And so there has to be this connection between the movement in the transformation of the political and economic institutions, in the transformation of the character of education, in the struggle over the disciplines, in the struggle within each of the religions, and somehow by a chain of analogies and affinities, which and here I'm simply restating my puzzle, this chain of analogies and affinities seems to be at once indispensable and impossible.
But then the one fundamental question, we're going to get right to Manny, is how do you cultivate the capacity to fight? He said at the end of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life, those around him were telling him that they were scared. They were afraid. And he said, I'd rather be dead than afraid. And he said, nope, I'm not that kind of Negro. I don't want to be dead. And so, and since King's death, neoliberal soulcraft is one that puts a very low premium on learning how to fight against the grain. The aim is to be conformist. Yes. The aim is to make you bid for the mainstream. Why do you fight? What sustains your fight?
Well, this is already Tocqueville's theme.
No, not the Tocqueville. We're talking about Unger.
Yes, I know. I know. Well, we agree about this. So, courage is the enabling virtue. It's the virtue without which all other virtues are rendered sterile.
Absolutely.
But you can't really sustain courage just moralistically as an imperative. Right. Courage is intimately related to hope. And the hope can't be just a collective hope. It has to be a personal hope. So you can't view your own life as just the instrument for the advancement of a collective project.
That's right.
You have to feel that by your engagement in that struggle, you are brought to a higher level of experience, no matter what happens to you. And once you taste that, that then becomes something that you can no longer give up, because you've had a foretaste of a higher life. And that seems to be an essential part of the basis of this transformative courage.
Back to self-cultivation in a certain circle. You've been tasting for 50 years, right? Once you tasted it, you couldn't give it up.
You can't give up once you have it. Which is not to say that you're protected against being afraid.
Right.
And against terrible things happening to you.
Absolutely, Brother Manny, jump right in. No, indeed. You know, Martin also said to Ralph Abernathy, he said, maybe our commitment to nonviolence in the end is not strong enough. Violence will take over. And he said, in the end, the Wallicites and the Bircherites, that was the right wing of his day, would produce a fascist America. He said, there's a good chance we're going in that direction. That's 1968 that he says that, in which this kind of self-cultivation toward nonviolence, this concern about love and justice, as opposed to hatred and revenge, it looks as if it's more and more impotent, more and more helpless and hopeless and powerless in that way. And so you're absolutely right. I think at the very end, Martin said, well, are we integrating into a burning house? Is it the case that the kind of prophetic witness that we're trying to bear and the taste that we've had of wanting to fight, learning how to fight? He'd been to jail 32 times, right? And he quite seriously thought about fasting unto death. That was echoes of Gandhi on the one hand. It was echoes of Cesar Chavez in February 1968, as Professor Walton just reminded us a few minutes ago, who said he was going to fast unto death. He's feeling as if he's just pushed to the edge in terms of the ability of both himself, the movement, and most importantly, the society to be receptive enough not to go in a hateful, revenge-centered fascist direction. You see, not to be so xenophobic against so many of the weak and the vulnerable, whoever they are. Immigrants, gays, lesbians, black folk, Jews, Arabs, Muslims, whoever the candidates are. And he was thinking, oh my God, maybe all I can do is give my all. What is my all? Death. Fight until death. Be faithful until death in that way. And that's part of what I was trying to suggest in that piece yesterday, because what happens is that what it really means to be committed to a certain kind of fight, intellectually, spiritually, morally, politically, without being self-righteous, means you really do have to acknowledge massive failure and defeat and still keep fighting. And still keep fighting. And that requires a certain kind of tragicomic sensibility, where certain failure is built in, but that failure is never strong enough to stop you from doing what you're doing. And that is a spiritual, existential, moral kind of affair. Very, very much so. Very, very much so. But those last, those quotes of Martin at the very end of his life are really quite telling. Did I get at your question?
Yeah. I'd like for you to touch more on the parallels between.
Martin and Malcolm. Yeah. No, Malcolm was never disappointed in America. He had no expectations. No, it's true. He had no expectations. He comes out of Elijah Muhammad. Elijah Muhammad went to jail because he refused to fight against the Japanese. The Japanese fascists, gangsters, thugs. He refused to fight against the Japanese. He went to jail in the 1940s and was treated like a dog, like a cockroach, you see, because he was a nationalist. He didn't believe in having an allegiance to another nation state. He had his own nation state. It just didn't have any land. It was just an imaginary construct. And so it's like you and I. Are we going to fight for the nation state of Uruguay? I mean, you might be an internationalist and cosmopolitan. I can appreciate that. But for the most part, no. Nation states have their own constituencies. Elijah Muhammad never conceived of himself as a citizen of a nation state that lynched his uncle. So that when Malcolm comes along, he says, there's no expectation of U.S. nation state. What is Martin Luther King Jr. doing? Why does he have expectations? His dream will become a nightmare. I'm telling him that now. That's what he said in '63, what he called the picnic, the March on Washington. He was there. He's right there in the hotel in Washington, D.C. He said, you're going to lead these folk into a nightmare because I don't know why you have expectations. Martin comes back. So what's the option? What is the option? So in that sense, Malcolm is the ultimate pessimist when it comes to American promise. But then what is the alternative? And he has to grow and develop and mature so he recognizes white people are not devils. It's just many have devilish behavior. He recognized black people have devilish behaviors. They're not in any way saints or gods either, and so forth. Moving toward a much more revolutionary humanist position in that way. But there's also overlap. They were going to work together, as you know, to go to the United Nations and bring critique to bear on the violation of human rights in the states in relation to black and indigenous peoples. They were going to work together in that regard.
When we talk about the parallels of pessimism between the both of them, you also mentioned in your article a quote that Martin Luther King
brothers and sisters from Japan. Yeah, yeah.
Now, Cornell, maybe
Yeah.
this would be a good point
I'm
to
sorry
try
to
out.
leave you enough time, though, brother. It's 2:30 already.
Yeah, to try out. No, instead of addressing directly
Yes.
what I had planned to address, I think this might be a good time to change direction and ask the
Sure.
class,
Oh, right.
now that we're very far
That's right.
advanced
That's
in
right.
the arguments,
Right.
the arguments about the interpretation of the American experience and the arguments about the alternative American futures, the programmatic arguments. Whether there are ideas, ways of thinking, problems, and initiatives that you believe we have disregarded in our discussions here. So we've assigned you this paper to write. The paper is really just an opportunity for you to engage the argument of the course, and by engaging it, to develop your own position and your own voice. So now might be a good time to see whether there are concerns arising from the preparation of these papers that you would like us to discuss now, here that we're all together.
Do you want to continue?
Yes.
So I'm a huge fan of your model of transformation, which results in Americans. However, an issue that I take with it is that there's been little discourse regarding how it can be inclusive to also positively affect the victims of our imperial conquest overseas in terms of economic migrants and refugees, especially in the Middle East and in Africa. So that's a paper I'm writing right now, and I would love for you to
So instead of commenting on each thing, so as many people as possible can speak, and we can hear your views about the suppressed themes in the course. Shall we ask many to speak? We hope that as many as possible would speak, and yes.
So much with how to convey what I've been hearing from you to my friends and family and neighbors, and how to actually communicate this for people who don't have the benefit of understanding it from the perspective that you bring, which involves history, economics, and law, and your life experience. And I'm actually going to write a paper about this, and I'm not sure how I'm going to do it, but I'm trying to find small pieces of communication that I can share, sort of in the lines of the way an ant colony organizes itself is every time an ant touches another ant. Their
Yes.
contact communicates a little piece of information that leads them in a different direction. And I'm thinking, how can I be an ant that can, without trying to indoctrinate anyone, simply in my being with them, communicate something, the revolutionary nature that I have learned from you, and I don't know how to do it. I'm going to struggle through it, but I just am looking for ways to send this information out more
Yes.
diversely.
Well, I think one of the things that's important, aside from understanding that we have particular positions and we made particular arguments, and our purpose is not to persuade you of the validity of our arguments and our positions. Our purpose is to light a fire, as I said the other day, and in the hope that it would provoke a parallel fire. But in that operation, you have to correct for the peculiarities of each one's style. So we each have our own styles. In my case, I have my mind has a systematizing a bias. And you know, the German philosopher Friedrich Schlegel said, two things are fatal to the mind. One is to have a system, and the other is not to have one. So you have to correct for this. Further, yes.
So a couple things that come to mind. One is what local alternatives already exist
Well, it's perfectly understandable to be asking us questions, but I was hoping that some of your statements would be propositions and as proposing alternative ways of thinking about our subject matter of the United States that we have failed to explore in the course. A different take on the American experience, on what makes the United States different, or a different perspective on the future. I mean, for example, just to take a theme that was contained in your statement just now, a very characteristically American way of beginning to design alternatives would be the multiplication of voices in the existing institutions, as in the example of worker participation in the administration of firms. That's a simple example. So a tendency in American political culture is, instead of redesigning the institution, you multiply the voices and the stakes in the existing institutions, and then you hope that the multiplication of the voices will produce the transformation that you desire in a different direction. That's an example of an underemphasized theme in our programmatic discussions that I think would immediately strike an American, because that's one of the most natural ways to go about programmatic arguments in American political culture.
And also the stress on localism.
On localism.
On localism.
Yes, which is related to a theme that we've discussed of the reinvention of federalism.
Yeah, yeah, but we haven't really accented
yes.
that in that way.
Yes.
And see, Sheldon Wolin, who was the greatest political theorist of democracy of his era, he just died a couple of years ago. A towering figure, PhD here at Harvard. He happened to be my thesis advisor at Princeton. You read his book, Democracy Incorporated, or his essays, Fugitive Democracy. He reached the conclusion the last hope for democratic practices were localistic, because the corporations, the monopolies, the oligopolies had taken over. And all you had left, like the city of Richmond, for example, in their battle with the Naval Yard and so forth, with Green Party mayor, local. But they actually ran things. And they actually won some victories. Of what's going on in Jackson, Mississippi. Local. Very different orientation, and certainly the state legislation of Mississippi. Certainly very different than even what Jerry Brown was doing as governor of California. So that localism in one's papers, one can pursue this in a very, very serious and substantive way that we have not been able to accent in that.
Even within the constraints of the established form of federalism.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So it's true that the established form of federalism radically underutilizes the experimentalist potential of a federalist arrangement. Nevertheless, even within this federal framework, there's a huge margin of maneuver for, as you suggest, local experiments.
Mm-hmm. We got a hand here and a hand there.
Yes.
Thank you. These Harvard freshmen are quite extraordinary. I tell you, I could just listen to you go on and on. But you're going to be thinking about writing about this, right?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Dynamite. 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 I think in King's case, because he was not fearless, because fearlessness is not courage. Fear is actually an instinct that's worth listening to. It's just that the courageous ones are the ones who work through fear. That the fear doesn't have the last word. You see. But the idea of thinking you can make it through life fearlessly with no fear, that's just utopian. You're wrestling with the fear. One of the fears of the American intellectual class is engaging with taboo issues where you're tagged in a certain way. So if you give a critique, let's say, of the Israeli occupation, and you fear being called an anti-Semite, and people ought to be feared of being anti-Semite. Anti-hatred, anti-Jewish hatred is barbaric. It's atrocious. It's pathological. It's a long, long history of hating Jews. And we ought to be cognizant, especially in Christian civilizations, though not exclusively Christian civilizations. But to try to make a moral and spiritual critique of an Israeli occupation and then being feared that you'll be called an anti-Semite, so you back away. Well, see, that's one of the ways in which fear can operate that downplays and diminishes your moral and spiritual commitments. Because Palestinians are human beings like anybody else. The same would be true if people refuse to engage Dreyfus the way so many of the folk did in the turn of the century, or refuse to say anything about Jews in Russia and so forth and so on, you see. So that's one of the things I was, and in a neoliberal soulcraft, the last thing you want to do is allow certain stigmas to be associated with trumping your career, trumping your possibilities, you see. Because it's true that, I mean, people who are anti-Semitic need to be radically called into question, need to be rendered accountable and so forth and so on. But once you get that stigma, it can be difficult to ever make your case. So a lot of people back off. For Martin King, he goes right into it. That's one reason why I included his piece in my Radical King book on Israel. And why he talks about the need for Arab development, treating them like human beings, even as we recognize the need for there to be a place where Jews can be have a sense of security after 2,000 years of being treated like they're less than human and so forth. So I mean, that issue of fear versus love, what breaks the back of fear? Well, usually love is the major thing that breaks it. Love of truth can break the back of fear. Love of goodness can break the back of being tied to evil. Love of beauty can break the back of being tied to wrestling with the terror and trauma that usually goes into the transfiguration that we call the beautiful, rooted in trauma and terror and so forth. So that's part of what I had in mind in that piece. But we've got our dear brother here.
Thank you. This is a very specific point that I recall you saying earlier in the semester, and the context might have been very important, you might not necessarily agree with the statement now.
Sure.
That you cannot change a system of oppression, or rather, you can't change an oppressive system from within the system. And you were talking about revolution, the importance of revolution, the sort of dialectical process that we go through. And then earlier, Mr. Unger was talking about, as I understood it, how moral leaders would often refrain from engaging in political life because it would corrupt their moral authority in some way. Is what I understood. So my question is, I'm not clear on where the two of you stand on this, and I've been thinking about it a lot. It's just a question of whether you can change an imperialistic system, economic, social, political system of oppression and exploitation from within that system. Can you be a good guy on the inside, so to speak, or is the only choice to opt out of that system to some extent, to whatever extent possible, and apply external pressure on that system to change?
Well, we're all insiders in some respect,
All
right?
of us are inside.
So
Yeah.
I'm not sure I understand fully the contrast between inside and outside. I think it's something profound and omnipresent in social life, and it's part of the ideal of these radical democratic experiments, that we would all teach ourselves to be both insiders and outsiders. That's one of the major dimensions of freedom, of empowerment. Because if we have to choose between engaging in a world and surrendering to it in order to engage in it, or standing apart from the world and being isolated from it, then we are disempowered. So that choice is itself a condemnation to disempowerment. And so one of the major dimensions of the enhancement of being, we're calling empowerment or agency, is that we could, to a greater extent, engage in the world without surrendering to it. We could be inside of it without ceasing to be outsiders. To use the Christian terminology, we could be in the world without being of it. That's one of the major dimensions of this enhancement of agency. So then one of the attributes of political and economic arrangements that we would desire is that they make it easier for us to do that. So the market economy is not tied to a single version of itself. There would be alternative regimes of contract and property coexisting experimentally within the same economic order. In politics, the political regime would facilitate its own revision by this combination of attributes that we discussed: higher political mobilization, quicker pace, combination of central initiative with local deviation. But insofar as those institutional changes have not taken place, then we have to, in our own moral experience, for ourselves, find a way to do what the species has not done collectively through institutional transformation. So in this sense, virtue is the provisional surrogate for structural change. So we have to find a way of living in these imperfect institutions, which have not yet been changed in this direction, as both insiders and outsiders. And that's a great project. That's a moral project, which runs parallel to these political and economic projects that we've been discussing in the course. A way of life, the conduct of life, in a form that allows us to be both insiders and outsiders all the time. So even in academic life. So what happens in the normal trajectory of an academic career? A young academic assimilates in his 20s a structure of analysis and argument, and then spends the rest of his life feeding material through that slot machine. And that, of course, is the death of the spirit. And it shouldn't be that way. There should be an agenda, and the agenda should require the periodic burning up of the methods. Methods are a dime a dozen. What counts is the agenda. We go forward through this periodic revolution. And so we want a form of routine science that has revolutionary attributes. So that's what we have to do in every domain of our experience. And before we do that politically, we have to do that personally. And that's this relation. And these examples that we've been discussing of King and Gandhi bear on that. Now, under constraint, it's a revealing. They are revealing examples, but they are also, to my mind, disturbing examples, because they've done this trick, as it were. They performed this miracle by standing aside in this position of the priest or the prophet who doesn't mess up with dirty politics and stands outside giving this testimony. But we we can't be Pontius Pilate. We can't have clean hands. Our campaigns can't begin and end in hand washing. So we have to do the dirty stuff also. We have to engage. That's part of this business of being an insider and an outsider.
Absolutely. Just very quickly, though, we got two other hands here, is that I think one of the beautiful things about being part and parcel of such a wretched species that we are is that no matter how oppressive regimes and structures are, we still find persons of integrity, honesty, decency inside of those regimes. Across time and space, cross culture, cross civilizations, you see. So that when we're talking about good persons, or persons aspiring to be decent, let's say, good maybe in that way, empirically you can find it. You really can.
And not just you can find individuals who are like that, but in every individual you can find some element of that. Because we're never just the puppets of the regime that we happen to be in.
But see, he's got even more faith than I do in the human capacity and potential. But I think you're right. So in that sense, of course you can always reform oppressive regimes. But keep in mind, I mean, we're calling for fundamental transformation. King, at the end of his life, called for what? Revolution in values, revolution in basic structures of institutions, revolution in consciousness, revolution in culture, revolution in religions, and so forth and so on, you see. But that's vision. In terms of execution, you're still going to be locked in the context in which various structures of oppression are operating, even as they change. And we see that 50 years later. Is America a better place in terms of white supremacy 50 years later? Yes and no. You can't answer just yes. You can't answer just no. The yes means there's been magnificent progress. There's been unprecedented breakthroughs, access to opportunity. No, not just the expectations, but the spirits are less. The ghettos have become hoods. I grew up in a ghetto. But we had ties of sympathy and empathy. A hood, survival of the slickest. That's worse. Not just materially, spiritually, that's worse. See what I mean? Wall Street has changed. More greedy now than before in terms of the culture of Wall Street. And anybody on Wall Street in the 1970s and 80s will tell you that. The history of the Goldman and Sachs, it's a different culture in Goldman and Sachs in the 70s and 80s than it is now in terms of greed. See, so that you can see different registers and different criteria, words yes and no, at the same time. And I think that yes and no is always very important in terms of trying to be honest and candid about where we are. But the answer to your question is yes, reform is possible. Yes, you do find decent folk in a variety of different contexts. But we've got two quick hands before we end here.
Yeah, I apologize. This is another very specific point. But Dr. Wester, remember last batch you talked about being influenced by council comments.
Yes, absolutely.
I was wondering how exactly that would fit in, or if it does fit into a future vision, or if it can be adapted to the American context or anything like that.
So,
Yes.
so why don't we hear everyone first, and then we'll see if there's time left, because there were some other hands raised.
Oh, some other hands too.
Yeah.
And maybe we'll spill over with
Yes,
some of this
absolutely.
next.
Next-
So to keep that on
next
the
week.
table, don't
Yeah.
remind us though, because that's. But there was another. Yes. Okay.
So we had a chance a few times throughout the course to talk about how politically progressive Americans have failed to come up with a sequel to the New Deal. But I feel like we could have spent more time thinking about, in terms of left soulcraft, in terms of the left's conception
Yes.
of who people are in society. We may have talked more about how that might also be a failure in moving towards a world where people are bigger, a more shared bigness. Thinking about identity politics, and especially thinking about how the left often conceives of people as primarily victims of conditioning and socialization in the institutions they live in, and how radicalization amongst the left tends to look like understanding greater and greater responsibility and agency of institutions, and more victimization and kind of littleness amongst people. It seems like within the course we could have spent more time thinking of the current sort of mainstream left view of society and of people within their
Awesome. Very important question.
Thank you. I was really inspired by both examples of democratic energies that you all have highlighted throughout American history. And but I'm curious how much, what things are easy to record and to count, and where the failures of memory and history have limited our ability to see those democratic energies. I'm wondering in what ways very common everyday activities represent just as much the vanguard of the democratic wisdom of our people as these artistic triumphs. So I'm curious about moments when people pushed through pain to care for their neighbors and to try to build better lives together in a more everyday sense, and how I might identify some of those that are, you were all telling a big historic story where it's hard to identify these kind of smaller moments, but I'm curious to pick up on that and try to find the small things in the present day that tell the same story.
And what would be one example you had in mind, though, brother?
So one example would be a woman who, after miscarrying, gives her neighbor the baby clothes, or those kinds of things, where people push through pain to do something.
Yes.
Deciding to love through pain in timeless challenge.
So a theme that has come up in several of the remarks is this theme of the relation between greatness and solidarity, right? So there are these two ideas. There's this idea of the enhancement of agency. The ordinary becomes more powerful. And then there's the idea of cooperation, of solidarity, of sacrifice. And in our tradition in the West, we think that these two ideas are in tension or even in contradiction. The idea of greatness is a pagan idea, and then behind solidarity is Christian love. And there's this tension between pagan greatness and Christian love. But the hope of democracy is that they wouldn't be in tension, and that we wouldn't think of greatness in this pagan way, but we would think of it as this ascent to a higher form of life in which we become capable of greater magnanimity because we are stronger. And all our forms of cooperation, instead of driving us down into conformity, enhance our agency. That's the idea that we're driving toward in the normative part of our discussions. And but it's inexplicit, and it has to be developed not only as idea, but also in the practices and institutions which would give it reality.
Absolutely. One last question before, or just comment. It doesn't have to be a question.
Well, I appreciate you mentioning Thomas and the instances throughout this course when we talked a little bit about socialism as another project that has a lot to say about radical love and imagination and courage and struggle and challenging ourselves to demand a better world, more
Where does that take place?
It's in Emerson Hall on the third floor
Emerson, at what time?
at 7 p.m.
At 7 p.m.
Of course, the question is, what is socialism? Because socialism used to mean statism. Now it's supposed to mean something else. And what's the something else? That's the object of our discussion.
That's part of that Council
Yes.
Communist
Yes.
thing, of Gorder and Panicoke and Rosa Luxemburg and others. It's not about the state. It's about decentralized orientation, about accountability of any consolidation of power and so forth. And they struggle within the tradition in that way. I'm also told there's a lecture at 3 o'clock at the Hip Hop Archives of those who are interested. It's this brother from Interscope. But all right, have a wonderful week. Look like we got sunshine out there.
If you are an Infinity School student, you have to turn in your final exam in hard copy at Andover Hall. Check Canvas for the announcement.
Oh, was there another announcement? What was that?